Hello, welcome back to Nancy Goodaim, the Space Ranger. This is chapter 6, and in about 2 chapters' time, it'll be getting into a little bit of hard sci-fi. Hoping to get hold of a couple of voice actors to do that bit. But in the meantime, the surreal madness continues on planet Mars. And so it was on the first morning of the first day of the first human crewed mission to Mars. Mission specialist Nancy McGinley, armed with a crossbow, walking with a Martian sheriff, 2 Martian bit-part posse members called Budadaw and Flirnt, 1 Martian machine operator called Habobble Gubbersnatch, and mission specialist Bart McMurrow. They were walking in the direction of the Unterdawn platform, which is a place Martians use to launch spacecraft. Sadly, the foremost Martian space exploration expert was busy serving lunches in a large grain silo-shaped canteen. Nancy wondered what she would find at the launch platform. The wonderment resolved itself roughly 3 minutes into the walk. The answer took the form of a rocket, about the size of the Saturn V rocket used by NASA back in the 1960s. Only it was freestanding and resting on its fins, with a ladder leading up to a small door just above the end of the body tube. The rest of the Unterdawn platform came into full view roughly 6 minutes into the walk. It had the rocket, a large elevated rectangular platform, which was about the size of a football pitch, with thorny purple shrubs growing underneath it, and then steps up to the platform, and a second, smaller rocket. This one was resting on fins extending from its side and looked like a giant metallic mackerel. All of the group must have seen it at the same time because Habobble yelled, "Jupiterians!" The sheriff yelled, "I knew it!" Budadaw and Flirnt looked at the sheriff, and Bart yelled, "Get that crossbow ready, Nancy!" Bart needn't have bothered yelling. Nancy had it cocked, loaded and aimed at the fish/spacecraft. "Freeze in your tracks, European Space Agency Mission Specialist Bart McMurrow and European Space Agency Mission Specialist Nancy McGinley," shouted a voice from behind. All 6 turned to see the owner of the voice was a masked humanoid in a dirty green uniform, standing roughly 2 metres behind him and holding a stick-like object. The stick was aimed at the sheriff. There were 3 other uniformed stick-wielding masked humanoids behind the "Freeze in your tracks," shout he. "Fuck off, Jupiterians," urged the sheriff. His command didn't work. The 3 other stick-wielders pointed their canes at Budadaw, Flirnt and Habobble. "No," replied the masked shout he. "We won't," added one of his companions. "Not until we have these 2 humanoids captured and contained on board our spacecraft," added another. "Yes," agreed the 4th member of the group, who clearly wanted to contribute to the situation, even if it was only in the form of a 3-letter word. Habobble seemed to pick up on the lacklustre contribution from the 4th Jupiterian and, despite the apparent threat to his life, couldn't help pushing for something better. "What do you mean, yes? Nobody asked a question." He then turned to the sheriff. "Is it true that all followers of Sosman Borkstapel are as thick as planks?" "Yes, Habobble, all Sosniaks are indeed thick as planks, but we'd better do what they say, just as we don't end up like Jemima, Pudsnacker, the Deputer, or that mean old fool Snitteron McGongle." The sheriff slowly fumbled for his crossbow with one hand and gestured to the 4 extraterrestrial visitors with the other. He covertly used one hand to lift the riser on his crossbow. Everyone waited for him to continue speaking, except Habobble, who asked, "How do you mean? Eaten by a like a glimp, Sheriff?" "No," replied the sheriff. "I mean dead." He then moved the crossbow from his side, aimed it at the nearest Jupiterian, and fired in one swift movement. A little too swift for accuracy, and missed. The Jupiterians then roared something like, "Brabalo!" It had the effect of causing the other 3 Jupiterians to scatter, and somehow caused lightning to fire from the end of the sticks they were carrying. All bar the 1st Jupiterian missed anything except air. The nearest Jupiterian's lightning-created rod weapon thing delivered a shock to Habobble and incinerated him. The whole thing took 6.5 seconds from the sheriff's wonky first shot to the death of Habobble. "We give up," announced the sheriff. Nancy didn't hear. She released 4 bolts from her crossbow in quick succession. Each one hit a different Jupiterian. All 4 Jupiterians collapsed to the ground. The group stood in silence for several moments. "Poor Habobble," said Bart finally. There was nothing poor about that lad. He saved every wage he earned. No use to him now, though. Still, I'd have thought Butteraw Flint would have been the first of the group to die, said the sheriff. The group were silent for several more minutes. Still, there's plenty of distance left to cover yet. I'll bet the two of ye die before sunset, he said to them. Yes, Sheriff, said Butteraw. Indeed, you're probably right, agreed Flint. The sheriff nodded in acknowledgement to their individual acknowledgements of his prediction and walked over to the body of the nearest Jupiterian. He then hit it a solid kick in the head. Well, fair play, Nancy. These lads are good and dead. It was at that point that Bart noticed he was unable to notice Nancy. Nancy! He yelled. She's over at the Jupiterian rocket, said Flint. And she was. And she had boarded it too. Nancy had never been on board a Jupiterian spaceship before, but somehow she knew to climb up the small, narrow staircase that led into the belly of the giant mackerel-shaped spacecraft, and how to navigate through its interior without being noticed, which involved running along a narrow access corridor that followed the side of the ship. Before she or the crew of the spacecraft knew it, she had gained access to the control room. Her plan, one that had only been apparent to her as she did it, was to enter the control room and grab hold of the ship's Aldernon crystal. Nancy had no idea how she knew what an Aldernon crystal was. The crew of the Jupiterian spacecraft did not really know either. The one thing they all knew was that the spacecraft was not able to travel without it. Nancy's entrance to the control room was a little bit noisier than she had intended. The problem was the door she used to gain access was rarely used itself and made a giant noise. In fact, as far as the Jupiterian rocket captain was aware, that door had never been opened before. Jaggada, jaggada, chunk it went. Nancy's on-the-fly thinking had been to run into the control room really quickly once it opened, sprint past the 6 Jupiterian Royal Guards, who should have been facing the opposite direction towards the main entrance, put bolts on her crossbow into whomever of the 6 flight crew and commanding officers happened to be near the crystal housing, crack the crystal housing open, grab the crystal, threaten to smash it, and thereby hold the ship and its crew to ransom. She wasn't really aware of what she was going to do after that, but it didn't matter because the 6 Jupiterian Royal Guards that flanked the entrance and long control table dashboard were now facing her, and firing lightning in the same way as came from the stick weapons that the patrol had used moments before and hundreds of metres away. All of which meant Nancy jumped back into the corridor and rapidly retraced her steps to the small and narrow staircase, climbed back down it, and started running back towards Bart, the sheriff, Butteraw Flint, and the body of Habobble. Oh, and the bodies of the 4 members of a Jupiterian recon patrol. Sorry, it wasn't really time to describe the layout of the Jupiterian spacecraft a second ago. You might not be too bothered, or you might already have an idea, in which case the next 4 sentences are pointless. However, seeing as it's taken Nancy about 12 seconds to cross the platform, run down the steps, and onto the trail back to the group, here goes. The room was about the size of a small factory canteen, but round, with multicoloured lights and bits of rotating apparatus and strange automatic leather bellows operating at seemingly random points around the room. There were 6 chairs, but nobody was sitting. They probably jumped up when Nancy went ashka plank and the door went chugga chugga chugga. The whole place had the look and feel of something a conservative public broadcaster would put together in an attempt to make a fashionable set for a 70s funk band. Anyway, Jesus, Nancy, where did you get to? Shouted Bart. She was 10 feet away from the group and travelling towards them when he did. What are you doing jumping out of a Jupiterian spacecraft, he added. Trying to capture their Aldernon crystals, she replied. We need to move. Oh, they won't like that, said the sheriff. That ship can't fly without it. I didn't get it, snapped Nancy. Quickly, we need to hide, she urged. There are at least 17 armed crew on their way, she speed explained. Nancy had the attention of Bart, the sheriff, Butteraw and Flint, and they all watched as she ran back towards the launch platform. But instead of climbing the steps, she ran around them and underneath the platform, where the uncut growth of purple thorny bushes hid her from view. Come on, quick, she yelled. They did, but much less systematically and silently as Nancy did. Bart was first and hid quickly. The sheriff was second, and to be fair, had himself well and truly hidden before the clump of armed Jupiterian crew boots clattered across the platform. Unfortunately for Butteraw and Flint, they had a long history of waiting to be told what to do. This had developed into a sort of learned inertia, the outcome of which was they had waited to see exactly what the sheriff was going to do before moving, which left them still several metres away from the platform steps and any chance of hiding when the Jupiterians yelled, "Freeze in your tracks, Earthers! You are coming with us!" It was hard for Nancy to see exactly what was taking place a short distance from where she, Bart and the sheriff were hidden. But what she heard was, We're Martians, not Earthers. They say they're Martians, not Earthers, sir. I fiddlesticks heard. For Obligon's sake, Tranapula, is it your job to be an echo? No, sir. Then only repeat stuff I didn't hear. Yes, sir. How will I know? How will you know what? What you didn't hear, sir. I'll let you know. Yes, sir. Sir? Yes, Tranupula. How will you know when you haven't heard something, sir? Officer Tranumpula. Yes, sir. Shut your pie hole and get these 2 Earthers on board the rocket. But, sir, we were asked to capture the other 2 Earthians and bring them to Jupiter. These 2 are Martians. Ugly and stupid ones, too. Sosman won't be happy with them. He most certainly will not. But we were never told what the difference between Martians and Earthians is, were we? We weren't, sir. Exactly. So we weren't to know we had captured 2 humans and not a pair of inconsequential Martian bit-part posse members. Right, sir. So if we take them back, we've done exactly what was asked of us. But we know they're not Earthians. Look, do you want to end up like Hangel, Zump, Carntacur or Ombledon over there? Lying dead in the Martian dust with a crossbow bolt sticking out of your anterior glomp. Shot dead by a crazy Martian. While wandering about on the lookout for 2 prisoners that you technically have already found. No, sir, I do not want to end up dead like in the Martian dirt. Well, neither do I, and neither does any of the other still alive crew members. So let's go, before anyone else ends up dead. And by anyone, I mean you. And me. Yes, sir. And with that, the Jupiterian patrol climbed back up the steps to the Onterdon platform, marched their 2 prisoners over to the mackerel-shaped rocket ship, and climbed the narrow staircase into the ship. The stairs closed behind them. There was a large rumbling noise that shook the platform and a whoosh sound. The sheriff was the first to climb out from the purple torn hiding spot beneath the launch platform. Nancy and Bart followed, and all 3 watched the shrinking silhouette of a giant Jupiterian mackerel-shaped rocket arc and blast its way from view. Now, do you see why Martians hate Jupiterians? Asked the sheriff. Quick, snapped Nancy. Into the Martian rocket. Sheriff, you can launch and follow that rocket before we lose sight of the Jupiterians. Relax, Nancy. But it on front are not really relevant to the plot. It won't make much difference if they are tortured and killed by Sosman Borgstapel. And anyway, it's lunchtime. Nancy knew she needed to get to Jupiter, and that the one spacecraft in the platform was her only means. She also knew that she did not know how to operate it, and that she would need Martian help to get to Jupiter. Poor old Habobble, noted the sheriff again. That's 2 of those lads from the Basmilical mine that have been killed since Crumtullion 8 1/4. First Snither and McGongle, and now Habobble Gubbersnatch. You'd have to say the place was cursed. Why? Wondered Bart. Their deaths were unconnected. Curses don't follow logic, Mr. Bart. And that's the problem with them, advised the sheriff. Can we just board the rocket and take off and follow the Jupiterians? That would be a dramatic thing, and a good thing for the plot, Nancy, advised the sheriff. But none of us know how to operate a spacecraft. What are you banging on about, Sheriff? Asked Bart. Me and Nancy are 2 of the best astronauts in Europe. He got no response. It's a place on Earth. He still got no response. A big place, Bart explained. Bigger than Mars? Asked the sheriff. No. So can he fly the rocket or not? No, said Bart. Probably not, replied Nancy. I seem to only know everything about the Jupiterian rocket. When it comes to this one, my mind is blank. That's not surprising, replied the sheriff. Martian rockets are fairly unique. Well, the only one we have is anyway. And only Martina Rudderspitch knows how to operate it. He paused to wallow with pride in the profundity of his statement and see if either Nancy or Bart would emit a gasp of awe. They didn't. So he said, Come on, let's go back and see if she's free later to fly us to Jupiter. We can grab lunch while we're at it. The sheriff then started walking back down the dusty trail that led from the Onterdon platform back to the silo-shaped Martian canteen. Nancy followed, and so did Bart. And that was it for the early afternoon on the first day of the first ever crewed human mission to Mars. 1 dead Martian, 2 kidnapped inconsequential Martians, 1 hungry sheriff, 2 heroic ESA mission specialists, 4 dead Jupiterians, and a space rocket in need of a pilot. Right, that's that. I hope you could follow it. It's a bit of a mishmash and probably not the best recording in the world. This is a very budget operation, as you can imagine, and time condensed. But yeah, the more action for another 2 chapters, and then a bit of hard sci-fi, and hopefully a bit more of a classy production and a couple of voice actors. Alright, thanks for following. Chat to you next week.